I'll introduce myself just a bit. I have been a consultant for about 20 years, and I have been engaged in a number of different activities. I've bred parrots, I've done rescue and rehab informally, I've trained parrots, I've been a veterinary technician since 2002 with avian and exotic veterinarians. So I'm able to draw from a wide base of experience. And as a behavior consultant, I really love doing consultations about feather damaging behavior, feather destructive behavior, whatever you want to call it. Seems like some people feel very strongly that we should use one term or another. I simply don't care because, you know, the bottom line is the parrot is chewing his own feathers off, and that is really all that matters. But the reason I like so much doing these behavior cases is because, number one, biting and screaming cases are simple to solve. If you have a strong grasp of applied behavior analysis, they don't present much of a challenge in most cases. But feather destructive behavior cases are much more complex. They're a bit more like a crime scene investigation or something, because there are so many factors that cause the behavior, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go through the slides. But you cannot simply look at antecedents and consequences and solve that behavior. It's much more complex. You have to look at every area of the parrot's existence. And another reason I like doing these cases is because owners with biting and screaming parrots come to you pissed off. They are so mad at that parrot, and they feel victimized by the parrot. So you have to work your way through all of those emotions and arrive, hopefully, at a sense of compassion for the parrot before they're willing to listen to you. And people with severely fearful or phobic parrots generally have created that problem because of a high degree of cluelessness. And so, you know, that too presents its own challenge. But because of this, and I really wrote this haiku about the caregivers, they are just in grief. There is nothing more upsetting than watching a beloved parrot chew its own feathers off. And so they are much more ready right from the get-go to listen to your recommendations and implement them. So can everybody hear me okay? We're good? Okay, awesome. So let's get started. One thing I want you to know is that the information in this presentation is largely anecdotal. There have not been many studies done about this behavior in parrots. And so much of what I'm about to tell you today has just been drawn from my own experience over the last 20 years. Somehow along the way, I kind of got pegged as the feather destructive behavior consultant. So Susan Friedman sends me a lot of these cases. So I've done a lot of them. So I feel very solid in the information that I'm going to tell you today, but I have included the science whenever possible. So this behavior is quite common amongst companion parrots. It is thought to be a condition of captivity. We have observed parrots in the wild who are missing feathers, but to date, I don't believe that anybody understands what is causing that, whether it's a medical condition or truly a behavior. There was one study done by Cheryl Meehan with her colleagues Millam and Mensch, and in her report, she stated the incidence of feather damaging behavior has increased with the advent of hand raising and then subsequent sales to single bird households. So the behavior is directly tied to less than optimal conditions for these parrots in captivity, beginning from the way that we rear them and then continuing on in the way we keep them in our homes. And one of my concerns is that if you get on Facebook, you'll see very commonly statements by people that indicate, well, this is just something parrots do now, you know, and it's not any big deal. As long as he seems happy, then I don't have to worry about this. And so a lot of caregivers never really seek help for the problem, especially in its early stages. Instead of taking their bird to the veterinarian or seeking out a behavior consultant, they go on Facebook. And this is very much a case of the bad becoming normal, in my opinion, to borrow a phrase from Temple Grandin abandoned, because whenever a parrot destroys his feathers, that is a clear sign that something is very, very wrong in that parrot's life, and it needs to be taken seriously. And while not every case can be resolved completely, sometimes due to damage to the follicles, sometimes just because the behavior has begun to have such value to the parrot, it still is always important to work up a feather picking case, feather damaging behavior case, because at the very least you can improve the parrot's quality of life. And in most cases you can resolve the behavior to a certain extent. So the definition of this would be any self-inflicted destruction of feathers. And there are a large number of ways that parrots manage to do this out. Some of the smaller cockatoos will actually pull their feathers out of the sides of their faces using their feet. As far as I can tell, nobody knows what causes that. It's really quite a mystery, but it's very common, actually. I had the good luck to have dinner with Julie Murad, the director of the Gabriel Foundation in Colorado, whom I've known for lots of years. And we were comparing notes, and she's got several small cockatoos. It happens largely with goffins, bare-eyed cockatoos, red-vented cockatoos, to name 3 of the most common ones. And of course, they chew them off at the body. Sometimes they pull them right out of the follicles. Barbering is very common, and that's where a parrot just snips off little pieces of feathers, so that if you look at their back, it looks like their feathers have sort of a chevroned appearance, like the ends of arrows, you know. And then some parrots, like this one right here, shred the barbules right off the shaft. If you can see, she's still got the feather shafts of all of them, but the barbules are completely gone. It's very odd. But this does not, and this is the message I want you to take from this slide, it does not include self-mutilation, meaning that the parrot chews holes into its skin. There's a common misperception out there that if your parrot begins to damage its feathers, it will lead to self-mutilation, and that is not the case at all. Sometimes both conditions occur in the same bird, but one does not lead to the other. So that sometimes is a very reassuring piece of information to parrot caregivers who are panicked that, you know, they're going to come in one day and find their bird lacking skin as well. So this is a difficult problem to solve just because it is so much more complex than many others. And in most cases, there are several factors that combine together to kind of push the bird over the edge into this extreme behavior. And then there's usually a trigger as well. And this is something that leads to so much confusion, because many people with parrots who have this problem will say to you, and you'll read this on Facebook all the time, well, my bird you know, started feather picking because my cat died, or I got a divorce, or my dog had surgery. I mean, they've got a million reasons, but that is never the cause of the behavior. So I'm going to show you something by using this board over here. I heard a consultant once explain it this way, and I very much like it, in that what he said is, okay, let's call this the feather picking point. So let's say that you have a parrot that was force weaned by the breeder, which means, does everybody know what force weaning means? There are 2 ways to wean a parrot. You can let them become food independent at their own time and pace, which is a much more functional way of attaining that end result. Or the parrot can be force weaned, meaning that the breeder drops feedings, creating so much hunger that the parrot is forced to learn to eat independently long before it would if it were allowed to do that according to its own developmental pace. And so that creates quite a bit of anxiety in the young parrot. So that might place the parrot, say, up here towards the feather picking point. And then let's say that before the breeder shipped the parrot, it gave it a too short wing trim. So now it lacks balance and it falls if it tries to fly. So that might move it up here towards the feather picking point. And then let's say the breeder ships it by airplane in cargo to the new owner, which is a tremendously stressful experience. So that might move the parrot up here towards the feather picking point. And then it's adopted by a first-time parrot owner who doesn't understand the need for enrichment. So that moves the little bird up here towards the feather picking point. And then let's say that the owner goes on vacation, leaves the bird with a caregiver that the bird doesn't know at all, which is, again, an extremely stressful experience for a parrot because that human has come to be that parrot's flock. And now that flock is gone. And so that becomes the trigger and moves the parrot up over that feather picking point. So this is the way that these problems begin. So it's not the fact that the cat died. It's not the fact that the dog had surgery or anything else. So solving these problems really requires a different skill set, as I was saying earlier. You cannot, as much as I love to use applied behavior analysis to solve behavior problems, you cannot rely on that discipline solely to solve a problem with feather destructive behavior. Instead, it really requires some investigative skills so that you look at every single aspect of that parrot's life, from diet to bathing to, well, everything. So when it comes to identifying the causes of this problem, many people say, well, feather picking is behavioral. You'll even hear a lot of veterinarians refer to it as behavioral. I object to that term because it tells us nothing. We know it's a behavior. The parrot is reaching down and chewing its feathers off. So I prefer to refer to it and to the causes as either medical or non-medical. Words are important. So medical causes, there are a number of them. Some birds chew the wire in their cages. They, get down on the floor and chew the lead weights out of curtains. Parrots are pretty darn good at getting themselves into trouble, and they can develop zinc or lead toxicity. That is one verified cause of this problem. Tumors can also be implicated. Many times if it's a tumor, the bird will feather pick over the site of the tumor. So if you have a bird chewing in just one area over the torso, that would be a very clear sign that that bird needs a veterinary exam as soon as possible. Thyroid dysfunction, liver disease. Liver disease is actually very common in parrots because we're so fond of feeding them seed diets, and the high fat in those seed diets will lead to fatty liver disease and then in turn to feather destructive behavior. And then there are a host of infections that birds can get as well. Some have parasites. We still have birds in our community who were wild caught, came through quarantine stations, were not always adequately wormed. So, a lot of vets don't do fecal analyses anymore. The first vet I worked for did, and we did find parasites. We found roundworms, we found giardia. So this is still a possible cause, as well as bacterial, fungal, and viral infections as well. So the first cause, or the first step for any feather destructive behavior problem is to get that bird to a veterinarian. I never provide a prognosis to caregivers when it comes to biting and screaming because, number one, they lack motivation because they're so often on the fence between getting rid of the bird or actually implementing recommendations. But because of the grief that caregivers so often feel when they have birds engaged in this behavior, I think it is only fair to give them realistic expectations. And from my experience, if somebody seeks help within the first 6 months of their parrot developing this problem, I can pretty much guarantee them a 95% chance that we will completely resolve the problem. If it's between 6 months and a year, it drops to about 85%. If the bird's been doing it for 2 years, I'd give them about 75%. And if the bird's engaged in it for over 5 years, 50% or less. But But nevertheless, I encourage them to go ahead through the process of doing a consultation, because at the very least you can improve that bird's quality of life. And often over time, that bird can grow more feathers. But I believe the problem is that the longer the bird engages in the behavior, the more it begins to have value to the parrot. You know, you can call it a habit. I don't particularly like that. But, you know, one thing that we do know is that every feather is attached to a nerve. And it has been hypothesized that just as people who cut themselves derive a sense of relief from that, there may be an inherent reinforcement for these birds who are destroying their feathers, in that something happens physiologically that relieves something for them. I mean, again, we just don't know, but it's a possibility. So these are all of the proposed non-medical causes. Inappropriate diet certainly is one. Stress and anxiety can certainly be a part of a problem. Increased production of reproductive hormones is quite common. Lack of foraging behavior, lack of interaction with enrichment, not getting enough bathing opportunities, inadequate rest sometimes comes into play, although not as often as you might think. I do think lack of exercise is a big one. Certainly lack of learning opportunities. No access to fresh air and sunshine. That's something that is rarely mentioned, but I've always been a strong advocate of getting birds outdoors into outside aviaries. And what I say to people who resist is just simply this: you know, how would you feel if somebody told you that you could never go outside again? You might not even want to keep living, at least me. I mean, I get so much from being outdoors. And while often people recommend full spectrum lighting, again, common sense has to come into play here, in that, you know, what would you prefer to do? Sit under a light bulb or go outside and enjoy the sunshine? It's just a matter of common sense. And then foreign substances on feathers as well. I included this photo for a reason. I think it's very interesting. This bird looks like this simply because it's never been bathed. I did this consultation with the owner, and as soon as she implemented bathing, that bird developed a beautiful set of feathers. It just simply wasn't preening normally. So, as I said, the first step in all cases certainly is to get that bird to an avian veterinarian, and hear this, who has experience with feather destructive behavior. Many vets are not well versed in this problem, and it's quite common for my clients to tell me that they took the bird to a vet, and the first thing that that vet wanted to do, and again, the assumption on the vet's part is that this is a psychogenic behavior. So they want to either collar the bird or prescribe medications right off the gate. And if you encounter a situation like this, again, you're treading in rough waters here, but a second opinion would certainly be indicated, because diagnostics need to be done: a complete blood count, a chemistry panel, a gram stain or culture insensitivity, a fecal analysis. That bird needs to be worked up. And so many clients, of course, will come to you and they will not have done this as a first step. So I think it's only fair to prepare them that that vet will want to do diagnostics, and that they should be prepared to say yes and to pay for those. Collaring on a feather destructive behavior case should never, ever be done unless the bird is also self-mutilating its skin and it's a life-threatening situation. Because if you collar a bird, all you're doing is treating the symptoms. You're doing nothing to identify the underlying causes. And what happens is you can keep that collar on that bird for 6 months. It will become fully feathered. And the minute you take that collar off, all the feathers are gone as well. So it accomplishes nothing. And moreover, it can be very detrimental to resolution of the problem, because, you know, if part of the problem is a lack of foraging behavior or a lack of interest in enrichment, putting a collar on a bird makes it almost impossible for them to engage in those behaviors that might truly help to improve the problem. So if it is deemed non-medical, There are some clues that you can get by looking at where on the body the behavior began first, and also by looking at what time of day the behavior is occurring, and is there a particular place in the house where the behavior is occurring. So by looking at those things, you get clues, and that is all they are. It's just one piece of the puzzle that you can take into account. But I can tell you that a young parrot like this, do you know how to tell that this African gray is a baby? Just as an aside, it's because his eyes are all black. When African grays are born, you cannot see their irises. Their eyes are completely dark. By about 6 months, you can start to see it here if you look closely. The irises begin to become sort of light gray, and by the time the African gray is an adult, the irises are golden. So anyway, for what that's worth. So if you have a young parrot who suddenly starts to chew off its wing feathers and its tail feathers, that is a strong indicator that it is stress that is causing that problem. And so that's when you want to look really closely at that bird's history from the time it hatched, to the time that it was adopted by the owner. This is Gracie, and she did start on her tail and wing feathers, but quickly moved on to her chest, and that is often what happens. If you have an adult parrot who begins feather destructive behavior on the legs, that's a strong indicator that you should examine all the triggers for increased production of reproductive hormones. So you'll want to look at the diet for levels of fats and carbohydrates, at the type of social relationship that the parrot enjoys with the caregiver. Is there an element of a pair bond there? Does the parrot engage in cavity seeking, as this bird is doing here? Parrots are very, very good at teaching people to provide them with all the conditions that support breeding. And so you very often get a parrot, if you have all of these things in place, who is quite hormonal. Yes?
I don't mean to interrupt.
It's fine.
No, because I have a person I'm just dealing with right now. Could a mirror trigger the biting of the...
I don't believe so. Yeah, I think that's mythology. For a long time it was written that you shouldn't give parrots mirrors. I've never seen any evidence that that was the case. Yeah. Yeah, I actually kind of like to provide parrots with mirrors in some cases, especially if it's a single bird. African grays love to bang their beaks on hard objects, so it can be a bit of enrichment for them. If you have an adult parrot who starts to barber feathers over the back, creating that chevroned appearance, typically there are often 3 causes implicated in that. The first would be some form of stress or anxiety. Certainly you want to examine the triggers for reproductive hormones and lack of enrichment. If a parrot only destroys feathers at night, then that is a strong indicator that there may be a medical cause still present that may have been missed. The reason that that happens is because during the day, parrots tend to be distracted by things going on. Just like with us, if you have a sore back during the day, you may not notice it so much, but once you lie down to go to sleep, then it really, really bothers you. And so the same thing occurs in parrots. And another condition under which this happens is with caregivers who don't want to get up until 10 or 11 in the morning, and in the meantime, parrots always wake up as soon as any light creeps into the room at all. So that is prime feather destruction time between the time that the parrot wakes up and the owner gets themselves out of bed. So you want to look strongly at diet and nutrition. Seed mixes are not a complete diet for parrots, even though they are still widely fed. They're deficient in vitamin A, so over time the immune system will suffer. They're very high in fat, so that they lead to conditions like fatty liver disease. And many times caregivers rationalize feeding a diet high in nuts or seeds because they perceive that that is what birds eat in the wild. And I heard a term yesterday that's my new favorite phrase. It was that of a logical fallacy. You will often hear people say, well, you need to feed macaws lots of nuts because they eat lots of nuts in the wild. The problem is the nutritional requirements of macaws in the wild are not the same as nutritional requirements of parrots in captivity. So for birds, it's the same as people. It's just a simple matter of calories in versus calories out. And if you're feeding a bird a high-fat diet, you're going to develop not only some physical problems, but some behavioral ones as well. So the first thing you want to do is transition the parrot from a high-fat, high-carb diet to a high-quality formulated diet. Hopefully the vet has recommended a change like that. What I often find is that vets recommend the change, but they are so limited. We in the veterinary community are so limited in terms of the amount of information that we can cover within the time slot available for that appointment, that often we're not able to give the client the information that they really need in order to effect this change, because it is not a simple matter to convert a parrot to a better diet. So what I often find is that the vet has recommended a pelleted diet, but the owner's been completely incapable of converting the bird to that. So then you have the basis for helping them with that. And then as soon as you get the seeds and the nuts out of the diet, you're going to have the owner use those as reinforcers. Did somebody have a question? Okay. And then you also want to supplement with fresh vegetables, greens, whole grains, sprouts, and limited low-sugar fruits. But the overall level of fats and carbohydrates in the diet really does need to be limited because parrots very easily become fat and carbohydrate junkies. I have an intake form that I send out to clients before I get on the telephone with them, because most of the consulting that I do is by telephone. And I have a perverse sense of humor, so I continue to keep on this form the question, what are your bird's favorite foods? And I already know what the answer is. The answer is always the same. It's going to come back reading pasta, mashed potatoes, pizza crust, white rice, grapes, bananas, peanut butter filled pretzels, Ritz crackers, goldfish crackers, and the list goes on. It's always the same. And again, these birds are so good at teaching people to feed them a diet high in fats and carbohydrates, because these are categories of nutrients that are used for energy. And these birds are not yet domesticated, so they have all the same instincts as parrots in the wild. And in the wild, they need a lot of energy. They're engaged in flying for hundreds of miles, foraging, breeding and rearing young. But that is certainly not the case in captivity. So I don't encounter a lot of cases, really, where stress and anxiety is a major cause of the problem. And it's a matter of dismay to me that that is almost always the first go-to guess for people, for lay people. And I don't know why that is, other than just the large amount of misinformation that's available on the internet. But it was proposed as a cause by Meehan, Millam, and Mensch in the study that they did. They thought that common agricultural practices were a contributing factor, and I would certainly agree with that. Again, the two that occur most commonly, that are most damaging to young parrots, are forced weaning and then a lack of fledging. They are clipped before they ever have a chance to learn to fly and develop flight skills. And when you couple those two rearing practices, you induce a lack of coordination and a lack of confidence in that young bird. And it does carry them through their lives. It creates severely limiting conditions for that. And then they are sold into single bird households with first-time bird owners who have no idea how to handle that young bird. I have a case right now, a client contacted me, bless their hearts, before they ever got their first bird, which is a budgie. And they wanted to know how to set up the environment correctly and all of that. But they had no handling skills, so right from the get-go they taught that bird to bite, because they just simply did not know how to teach that little bird to step up and how to engage with them appropriately on a social level. And so this hypothesis was extrapolated from research on primates, because another study done at UC Davis showed that young monkeys that were taken from their mothers at 5 days and raised in a nursery had a much higher incidence than usual of self-injurious behaviors. And it was concluded in that study that these behaviors were a source of anxiety reduction for those primates. And as I mentioned earlier, feathers are attached to nerves, so this is a distinct possibility in these cases as well. And I do think that, I guess we have to make a differentiate between chronic stress and acute stress and anxiety. And I would certainly agree with the argument that chronic stress can be a strong cause of this problem. Because if you think about it, these parrots live in a state of chronic restraint. We clip their wings, we keep them in cages, we limit the number of choices that they're able to make. And so I think certainly life in captivity does contribute to this. And then as far as acute stress goes, I guess it was really this I was referring to when I said I don't see this often as a strong cause of this behavior, but we should always evaluate it or evaluate for it, certainly. As I said, it tends to be a first go-to guess for owners and vets, and I think that that is an incorrect approach. So when it is a cause, it's usually a cause because a number of acutely stressful things have happened within a short period of time. Parrots are pretty adaptable and they're pretty resilient. And so, excuse me, if they have one stressful event that happens, they're well able to recover from that. But if they have a stressful event in October and then another in November and then another in December, that may just push them over the edge because they haven't had enough time to really return to normal from those. And I have a case right now, kayaks almost never feather pick, but they're not bulletproof and they can be subject to stress. And so Oscar began to chew his feathers off suddenly last December, and this owner is awesome. She took him to a vet right away, and then the vet referred her to me, and she did follow through. But the family had to evacuate in August due to Hurricane Harvey. That was tremendously stressful. They had to go live in a different environment in very cramped quarters. And then in November, the family went on vacation for it was about a week, and just left him at home alone with a caregiver coming in once a day to take care of him. Never do that to a parrot. Never. You know, their sense of safety and security comes from being with the flock. And in captivity, you are their flock. And when the entire flock disappears and some stranger comes in once a day to take care of the parrot, you can expect problems to develop. And then in December, you had changing day length. That can certainly be a trigger, as well as Christmas and all the stress of that. And so he is already improving at this point in time due to our intervention. But whether or not you suspect that cause is a strong factor, I believe it's appropriate to teach caregivers about this while you have their attention. Because number one, most of them are not observant at all. They don't know how to read body language. And even if they do read body language, they tend to disregard the distress that their parrots evidence. You know, they just think, oh, well, that doesn't matter. He'll get over it. It does matter. It really does. And it's an ethical issue. We all need to do whatever we can to reduce stress for parrots in the homes. They really don't belong here with us. You know, if you think about it, I shouldn't swear if this is being recorded. I mean, what a stupid idea to take a flighted spirit out of the wild and clip its wings and put it in a cage. You know, I'd like to strangle the first individual who thought that that was a good idea. So I think that along the way we can provide a lot of education to caregivers, and this is an area where we really need to dive in and perhaps create a greater degree of sensitivity in them towards their parrots. But they also need specific suggestions, and what I mean by this is that too often parrot caregivers become overly protective of their birds. And so regarding stress, let's say, for example, a friend comes into the house wearing a ball cap and the bird freaks out because he's never seen a person wearing a hat before. That's certainly an unnecessary stressor, and that caregiver should immediately just request that the visitor take the hat off. But when it comes to the introduction of new perches or new toys, those are necessary stressors. And so in those cases, these caregivers need to be taught how to develop a desensitization and counter-conditioning plan plan in order to encourage that parent to make use of these enrichment items, because part of solving this problem is to introduce more enrichment. I do really think that the inability to fly is very stressful for parrots. They are prey animals. When they can't fly, they know instinctively that they cannot get away from dangerous situations. And they're also unable to make the steady stream of behavioral choices that they would make if they were still living in the wild. So this is something I look at. I hesitate to recommend at any point that caregivers allow their birds to become flighted, because that is not a simple process or a simple issue. But if the caregiver raises the issue, I'm happy to dive right in, because if I had my druthers, all captive parrots would be fully flighted. It would make us much better people. You know, well, we'll leave it at that. But it is true, you know, that not all parrots are good candidates for flight. You know, if you've got an 8-year-old Amazon who's overweight, that's not a good candidate for flight. I wouldn't even recommend it. You know, for one thing, the parrot has lost the desire to move about on its own. It's developed a sedentary lifestyle. And moreover, it's not fun for that parrot to fly. It's too much work. It would be like me, you know, deciding I was going to run 5 miles every day. That would not even last. I wouldn't last through the first run. So let's move on to the increased production of reproductive hormones. I do believe that this is heavily implicated in most cases. And it's also kind of a matter of debate. You know, whenever I bring this up, Margie gets a little nervous, I think, because we have so little documentation for this. But there does seem to be some general agreement on this issue occurring amongst veterinarians. And if you read Avian Medicine Principles and Application, which has always been kind of the textbook of avian medicine, it does state in there that damage to the feathers of the breast, abdomen, and legs during breeding season may indicate, you know, reproductive frustration. We can't possibly know if birds are feeling reproductively frustrated or not, but there is, I believe, strongly a direct correlation. The problem is we really cannot test currently for hormone levels in any sort of reliable fashion. I wanted to verify this, so I did some research right before I developed this presentation, and you can find evidence for testing for you know, cortisol levels and other hormone levels like those implicated in diabetes, but not for reproductive hormones. So we've got to go mostly on our anecdotal evidence, but I can tell you that I get a lot of referrals for this problem from veterinarians, and often they refer to me because of a physical problem that has developed in that bird has come to them being egg-bound. That's how I got one case right now. The bird almost lost its life in September because it became egg-bound and needed surgery. And in this case, the bird has a very strong pair bond with the caregiver. It was constantly engaging in cavity-seeking behaviors, in that it had learned how to get into the drawers in the kitchen as well as the cupboards, and was spending a large amount of time there. It was eating a seed mix, so it had a high-fat diet. And in my experience, these are all triggers. They're not the only triggers, but they are triggers for increased production of reproductive hormones. And that vet said, you go to Pam Clark and you get these things corrected. So she too, as well as other veterinarians, are recommending that these lifestyle types of triggers do cause this problem. So we're just going to have to wait for science to catch up to what we already know. So again, the primary triggers for increased hormone production are going to be the presence of a pair bond, meaning that that bird looks to the caregiver as a mate, the ability to engage in a lot of very affectionate interactions. It's very common for caregivers to want to cuddle with their birds, you know, for 30 minutes every night before bed. They let the birds go under the covers with them and sleep with them. They have them on their shoulder for large amounts of time during the day. Cavity-seeking behaviors are allowed. I actually knew one woman who emptied out all of her kitchen cupboards so that her macaw could spend time in there. I mean, people will do crazy things just in order to make their parrots happy because that's their perception. Here's a good example. This African gray figured out how to get up in this cupboard. This is my house. When I first moved in, these were my closet doors. They're those cheap wooden doors with the slats. And just being able to see a tiny slit of darkness is enough of a trigger. It's the promise of a nest, because this is what would happen in the wild. They would see, oh, this might be a hollow tree, because they can see a little bit of darkness in there, and they start to excavate the nest. Well, this is what Marco did with my closet. She created that hole, and now I replaced my closet doors. So parrots are very, very good at figuring out this stuff. Again, a diet high in fats and carbohydrates, and even a diet perhaps that provides too much food overall. A degree of sameness to the environment can certainly create this. At one veterinary clinic where I worked, we had a budgie who was engaged in chronic egg laying, and that is a life-threatening situation because it can lead to egg binding. And so one way that we got that bird to stop that behavior was we just had the owner, it was in a small enough cage to be transportable, she just moved that cage into a different room every single day. You know, again, kind of breaking down that degree of sameness. And then certainly the presence of other parrots in a reproductive state. I live in a unique situation in that I rent a house from a friend of mine, Chris Shank. Some of you may know her. Her website is cockatoodowns.com. And the property is 4.5 acres with 2 residences on it, hers and mine. And she has a whole flock of cockatoos who free fly outdoors and then return to their aviaries on cue. And those birds, when breeding season rolls around, man, she's got big time problems because all of those birds feed off of each other. So often the more birds you have in the house, especially if they're the same species, like my African grays kind of feed off of each other during the times of the year when it's common for them to go to nest. When am I supposed to stop? Do we know? We started at 8:45, so it would be 10:15? Okay, we're good. So this is something that it's very important to address with clients. The first thing you want to do is evolve the pair bond through training. And what you must understand is that this pair bond may have even more value to the client than it has to the parrot. You know, we all get pets to meet our emotional needs to some degree or another. And many, many people get parrots for this primary purpose, because parrots are especially well suited to this. They can speak to us in our own language. They're very sophisticated socially. They live in flocks, very much like we live, you know, amongst each other. And so you have to tread lightly when you come to speaking to clients about this. The first thing I will have somebody do is decide or figure out roughly how much time is that bird spending on your shoulder a day. You cannot just tell a client that they can't do that anymore. You will fail. They will never comply with that. And so if it's 2 hours a day that the parrot is spending on the owner's shoulder, I just ask them to kind of keep tabs, you know, set a timer, do whatever they have to, but just cut that down by 15 minutes, you know, each week or every 2 weeks, depending upon the client, and instead substitute some form of training for that behavior. And that accomplishes a couple of things. It helps the caregiver broaden their awareness of different types of ways they can relate to that parrot. And it also encourages the parrot to start to look to that person as a teacher, mentor, trainer, rather than as a sexual partner. I do have them immediately stop all inappropriate touching. They are not allowed to pet the parrot down the back. That's very stimulating. No petting under the wings, no petting on the chest, no cuddling at night. So, you know, I kind of take a halfway approach in the beginning. I recommend things I think they are capable of doing right away, even though they'll cause some pain. But that time on the shoulder needs to be sort of gradually whittled down. Then we address the diet, hopefully getting the birds on a formulated diet, supplemented with vegetables, whole grains, as close to nature as possible. No white rice, instead brown rice, kamut, quinoa, things like that. Very limited fruit. And then I encourage them, get that bird out of the house, you know, purchase an outdoor aviary and introduce the bird to that. That is one quick way to resolve this behavior. It is. And then take them for trips out of the house, take them for visits to friends. That kind of helps break down that sense of extreme safety that would instinctively say, you know, convey to that bird, it's okay to start laying eggs. And I included this photo for my own amusement and perhaps yours, because you do have to keep, once you make these recommendations, you do have to keep questioning the client. This bird belonged to a young man who had his own business, and he did his work inside of a warehouse that was not all finished, and his cockatoo stayed in the warehouse with him. And when we first started, the bird was spending its entire day in one of his desk drawers. It had a nice little nest there. And so we corrected all of that. We eliminated the nest. We provided some alternate perches. And he said to me, oh man, she's doing great. You know, instead she's just spending her time chewing on wood. And I said, why don't you send me a photo of that? This bird is engaging in nesting behaviors. You know, the definition of a small dark space can be pretty darn broad to a parrot. And so this was enough of a small dark space for her. She didn't need it completely enclosed, and she's there quite happily all day long engaging in her nesting behavior. And he thought this was great because she had more enrichment. So we had to refine our definition of my recommendations. Foraging and enrichment, I think that lack of independent activity is a big risk factor for the development of this behavior. And this was substantiated by another study done by Cheryl Meehan at UC Davis with orange-winged Amazons. And they did establish the conclusion that a very strong relationship exists between lack of behavioral opportunity, lack of foraging, and the development of feather damaging behavior. Unfortunately, if you know, foraging is a learned behavior. And so young parrots in the wild learn it from their parents. They will not instinctively develop this behavior. So in captivity, if a bird has not been provided with foraging opportunities all along, they will not know how to perform that behavior. And they do have to be taught by the owner who needs help with that. There was another study done in 1997, 1998 by Huber and Eichler and Weschler that examined the tendency of chickens to peck at themselves, and they did find that that pecking behavior stopped when these chickens were provided with just some simple foraging activities, like, you know, providing straw on the ground so that they could peck through and hunt for their food. And it was concluded once again that that feather damaging, that pecking behavior was caused by the bird's need to forage that was just not being provided for. And by the way, lack of foraging behaviors have often also been implicated in stereotypies that develop in parrots. If you have a parrot, this is common in Moluccan cockatoos, they will generate a lot of mucus in their mouths and then open their beaks, and so that this stringy mucus, you know, can be seen, and then they play with it, in other words. And this information came from Scott Eccles. I had the opportunity, he's an avian veterinarian in the United States, and I had the chance to talk to him when I was speaking in Australia. And he, I don't have any study I can reference, but he said that this has been established as a strong correlation. So foraging is a big deal. It's a core activity that parrots engage in the wild, and we do need to provide for it in captivity. Also, one of the problems is that caregivers don't really understand what parrots, oh, I'm sorry, yes?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I think I missed what you said. We have a umbrella cockatoo that does the saliva production and plays with it a lot. And I missed what you said. That's a correlation to desire.
To lack of foraging.
The lack of foraging.
Yeah, yeah. So another problem is that most people, when they think about getting parrot toys, they head right for Petco or PetSmart. And most of the parrot, well, a good number, they're doing a little better, but most of the toys sold there are really kind of inappropriate for parrots, in that caregivers will come home, you know, and have this big toy full of wooden blocks and give it to an African gray or an Amazon. And you know, those birds may in the first week chew the edges off of those big blocks, and then that toy will hang in the cage for a year gathering poop, and it, you know, it won't be replaced. So, you know, what parrots really like is stuff that they can destroy quickly. They like foraging opportunities. Once they learn to enjoy those, they like problem-solving activities, and they like learning activities. So they need some guidance. They really do need some help. And this was one of those 10 essential skills. I think that we all need to know what's out there on the market, what's worth buying, what's not buying. And it's very common for me to say to a caregiver, let's go to this website together while we're on the phone. Now, this toy is worth buying, this toy is worth buying, this toy is not. You can engender a great deal of loyalty in your client towards you and your practice if you help them out in this way, because people get really fed up with going out and spending $20 on a toy that just sits there in the cage, and then moreover they conclude, well, my bird just won't play with toys. And that's not the case at all. It's just that they're providing the wrong materials. So we need to help them choose wisely. We also need to help them learn about toy placement. In this consultation I was doing with this Kaik, she had the cage perched all wrong, and that is one thing I always request. I want, if it's a telephone consultation, I want photos of that cage. I want photos of the room in which the cage is located, any other perching sites, things like that. So she had the cage perched all wrong, but then moreover, she had a little ladder in there that Kaik might really like because they're so physical and so playful, but she had it attached to the side of the cage so that it was laying right against the side of the cage and then kind of fell down onto the floor gathering poop. You know, how could that bird possibly play with that toy? There was really nothing to do with it unless there was no perch near it. You know, the only thing he could possibly do would be to maybe cling to the cage bars and rattle the beads on it with his beak. So I just told her, hang it from the top of the cage so it hangs down near a perch. And now he plays with it, he climbs up and down it. So it's just an example of the fact that caregivers often need a lot of help with just very, very simple things. I do provide websites for foraging ideas. There are some great ones out there. Parrotenrichment.com is owned by Chris Porter, and she's a good friend of mine. We just had a conversation, and she's going to be adding even more resources to the site that show caregivers how to start with a very simple foraging toy and then make it a little harder and a little harder and a little harder, because that is how you're going to teach parrots how to forage. And then foragingforparrots.com is another one that's excellent. There's one cheap. I think you have one of these in your handouts. I do think that you have these websites.
That's all there.
Okay, great. All right, I won't go on then. But then we also need to make caregivers aware of the fact that because their parrot is a prey animal, that bird may not necessarily just attack a new toy right away. Parrots are often very wary or suspicious of new things that are added to the cage. And so we need to be ready to not only give them realistic expectations and teach them that just because their parrot doesn't immediately approach something, it doesn't mean they don't like it. That's a very typical conclusion that caregivers come to when they offer something new. Oh, well, he just doesn't like that play stand, so they get rid of it, instead of understanding that they need to implement a desensitization and counter conditioning plan in order to teach that bird to accept that. And so that is part of our job as well, to provide those plans for them. I once did a whole lot of research on quality of life, because this is very near and dear to my heart, the welfare of parrots in captivity. As I said, it grieves me sorely that we initially brought these birds into captivity. I'm not a bleeding heart, and I don't spend too much time thinking about this because it's a done deal. We're not going to stop keeping birds in captivity. We're not going to return them to the wild. But I think it behooves us all to focus strongly on this issue of quality of life for these birds. And a lot of the science that's been done has been done on captive animals, animals living in veterinary clinics, zoos, parrots. And it has been shown that one of the strongest factors that will improve quality of life is the ability to make choices. And so training can become very important to these birds with any behavior problem, but especially feather damaging behavior. And training, you know, I often meet with a lot of resistance from caregivers on this issue, and I don't really understand why, frankly. A lot of them perceive training as something that can be demeaning to the parrot. You know, why should I teach him tricks? I get a lot of resistance about this, but actually training is just simply offering choices. You're not forcing the parrot to engage. It's a simple choice. Do you want to touch this target stick? If you do, look at this. I've got a treat for you. And parrots respond very, very well to this. And as I said, it will help to evolve that pair bond and create greater awareness in caregivers of different ways in which they can interact with their birds. And it is true that for any parrot who has a behavior problem, if you just start training, you will see a reduction in that behavior problem. It's quite amazing. You know, I look at it as kind of like the pie plate of reinforcement, in that if you create a circle graph of reinforcement, if the bird is getting 25% of its reinforcement because it's a screamer, and you instead alter that pie graph, so now it gets, you know, 15% of its reinforcement through learning opportunities, you're going to see a reduction in that problem behavior. So steps for the caregiver, I typically recommend that they teach targeting to start. Are you guys all familiar with that behavior? So it's very simple, helps the caregiver get into the kind of groove of training, and it's simple for the parrot to learn. I do give them video links as well as a step-by-step. You know, every client of mine gets a set of written recommendations, and one thing I've done to make that easier, I've developed these sort of plug-in modules. So I've got a plug-in module for targeting for a male bird, plug-in module for targeting for female bird. So when I'm generating these written recommendations, it's very simple. I just, you know, copy and paste in targeting instructions and instructions for bathing and all of this. It makes it a very quick matter. And so Stephanie Edlund has a remarkably great video on targeting that she just allowed me to use in one of my blog posts. So that is a great resource for caregivers. There's another one on projectparrot.com that's not too bad. But I'm careful where I direct people to go. I will not just say, go to YouTube and find a targeting video, because unfortunately training parrots has become very common, and there are a lot of really bad trainers out there. So I think we have to take responsibility for giving them links to the best information and the best examples of these things possible. And then, you know, I'm quick to remind clients that targeting can be used to teach a number of very useful behaviors. Once a bird becomes a good targeter, you can teach him to go into a carrier on cue, ring a bell, climb a ladder, turn around in a circle. That's when training really starts to become fun for these caregivers. And then I also, I tell them, you need to start catching your parrot in the act of being good. Meaning, you know, and for some people I say, take a sheet of notebook paper and draw a line down the center and get together with your other family members. And on the left-hand side, you write down all the behaviors you like that parrot does and that you would like to see them do more of. And on the right-hand side, you're going to write down the behaviors that you don't like so much. And those are the ones you're going to completely ignore. And then everybody in the house needs to understand the use of a marker and how to deliver reinforcers. And whenever anybody sees these behaviors that you like, on the left-hand side, that person's going to be quick to turn around and say yes and walk over with a food reinforcer. And that is a great way to quickly turn around behavior problems. Because that caregiver has a very specific set of instructions, and all of a sudden the bird is getting reinforced for all of these great behaviors. The level of reinforcement for that bird goes sky high, and greatly increases their quality of life, because now they've got a way to get the attention and the reinforcers that they need and want so much. And then I also encourage them strongly to start living as a trainer. I mean, in reality, in every social interaction you have, whether it's with an animal or a person, you know, one bird is, the bird is either training you or you're training the bird. There is no in between. There are no interactions in which that doesn't happen. And so I tell them, every time you ask that bird to step up or step off of you or go back into the cage, that bird needs a little thank you or a little paycheck for performing that behavior. That doesn't mean it always has to be food or anything else. And I do teach them how to tailor those reinforcers to the level of difficulty of the behavior that they're cueing. As an example, my African gray Marco, I've had her ever since she was a baby, back when I was breeding African grays, and she'd like to have a pair bond with me, but I'm really good at avoiding that, but she does love me. So when I ask her to come to my hand, I don't give her a reinforcer, because just coming to me is a reinforcer. But what is hard for her is getting off my hand. So every time she gets off my hand, that's when she gets head scratches, because that is her favorite reinforcer of all. Bathing is certainly a risk factor for feather damaging behavior. And a lot of veterinary clinics, veterinarians and technicians, this will be the first recommendation, because if you just get the client to start bathing the parrot, you can see an improvement in the problem almost right away, because bathing encourages normal preening and normal feather care. But you do have to help the client decide which method of bathing is most convenient for them. I figure they're not going to do it on a regular basis unless we can make it easy for them. So I kind of run through the options, have them choose which method they would prefer, and then we start to teach the parrot to enjoy that experience. One of the best options for bathing birds is to have an outdoor aviary and just put them out in the rain. You'll get a lot of more natural bathing behavior in a lot of species who often resist this. And I've had some remarkable experiences. I have never not had an outdoor aviary for my birds. I think it is a have to. It is an essential. And I don't care how much it costs. It has to be done. And so at one point, I've trained 2 of my African grays to free fly in California when I was living there. And I did not do it because I think free flight is a good idea. So please, none of you come away with that message. I do not recommend free flight for parrots, except for under very, very specific circumstances. And certainly you should never free fly a single parrot. But I had 2 birds out free flying, and it was raining, and I actually was able to observe my African grays leaf bathing through the oak trees. They were essentially swimming through the branches, leaf bathing. It was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. And so there is really something very enriching for parrots to bathe outdoors. My cockatoo, my Moluccan Cyrano, if I try and bathe him in the house, he does not enjoy it at all. If I put him in his outdoor aviary and turn the hose on him, he will bathe for 45 minutes. I get tired before he does. So that is something to really consider when you are talking with a caregiver. Again, I can't say enough about spending time in an outdoor aviary, and I will also share with you the fact that I don't bathe any of my African gray parrots in the house. They bathe outside in the rain, but just the fact of being in that outdoor aviary, experiencing fresh air and sunshine, encourages normal preening. So one way to get a great looking parrot is to put them out in that aviary. And it can also be a quick fix for hormonal parrots. This year I had an especially challenging time in that my Amazon lost his pair-bonded partner. I had to euthanize her because she had a thyroid tumor, and that was just a couple of months ago. So he quickly transferred his pair bond to one of my male African grays, go figure. That male African gray really wanted to form a pair bond with my female gray Marco, but she already had a pair bond with a male gray Babu. If you live with multiple birds in the household and they're fully flighted and they enjoy a lot of freedom, you wind up with these sorts of situations. And they were starting to fight with each other a little bit. You know, there was some territorial aggression going on, some resource guarding. So you know what? I just put them all outside to live for a couple of weeks. End of problem. I mean, it is a very, very useful thing to kind of reset the social situation in their home, in your home.
One quick question.
Yes.
Maybe it would be covered half, or how do you cover
I
it?
cover it halfway.
Okay.
Yes, so they have the choice not only to get away if they happen to see predators up in the sky, they can retreat to safety, but also they can seek shelter if they don't want to be out in the rain or the sunshine. Yes?
I guess just in terms of around here, what times of year can the birds be out?
More than you would think. In my experience, parrots can tolerate a temperature change of about 10 degrees. So if you keep your house at 62 degrees in the winter, you can put them out at 52 degrees. You know, if your house is 78 degrees, you can put them out at 88 degrees. But you can also fudge a bit in that it's easy to install sprinkler systems. They will reduce the temperature in an aviary by about 10 degrees, so you can get a little more use out of them that way. And then also in terms of cold, sometimes I will put a parrot who I can just tell has so much pent-up energy. I will put them out even when it's too cold, just for 20 minutes. If it's a healthy parrot, that's not going to put them at risk. And they use up a tremendous amount of energy. And another way you can fudge a bit is that, you know, you can either heat an animal up from the outside or from the inside. And another reason I had to put my birds outside is because that's how they get cared for when I travel for speaking engagements. And I wouldn't necessarily have put them out right at that time, but I felt pressured to do so. Otherwise, they would have had to have been in their cages for 6 days because Chris can't handle them. So I felt it was much better that they had the freedom to enjoy the aviary. And so this is one time when feeding a small amount of seed mix is appropriate, because that will raise their body temperature to have that excess fat in the diet. So just as reassurance to you, you know, I've always been a strong advocate, and there was a woman in Ohio who purchased a couple of African gray babies from me, actually, and I kept telling her, you need an outdoor aviary, you need an outdoor aviary, and she's like, no, it's way too cold, I wouldn't have enough time to use it. When I finally convinced her, she came back and she told me this is the single best thing I have ever done. So it is, I cannot speak enough to the benefits. Yes, Stephanie?
Just as someone from Sweden, where it's been cold in the wintertime, people have very often parrots in a way that they can go out all year round, and they will willingly go out in the snow, no problem, as long as they can choose to go warm themselves up. So they do a lot better than people do.
Yes, she's 100% right. Thank you for that. All right, and as I said, full spectrum lighting is even not a close second. I don't recommend it. I did talk to one veterinarian, and I have not heard this substantiated anywhere else, but she was convinced that too much exposure to full spectrum lighting has been implicated in the development of cataracts in parrots. And, you know, 20 years ago it was hailed as the solution to help parrots be healthier. You know, now we have more information that to actually be effective, it's got to be very close to the bird. It's not something I would ever consider for my birds. Well, I guess I'll leave it at that. I think rest can be a potential partial cause if it's added to other stressors. I do think that the requirements vary greatly from species to species and amongst individuals. And I take issue with that so commonly repeated information that parrots need 10 to 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep every single night. Again, another logical fallacy. For one thing, it is not dark in the wild. If you've ever been outside on a full moon, you know it's not dark. Secondly, it's not quiet. There are all kinds of nocturnal animals moving around. So I think that many of the New World parrots, Amazons, macaws, Pioneers, conures, that those birds may need more sleep every night. And these are also the species with which it can be successful if they are experiencing problems with increased production of reproductive hormones, often you can affect a positive change by reducing day length, because these are the birds. I mean, how often do you hear on Facebook along about March or April, as the day length starts to increase? That's when everybody gets online and goes, oh my God, my Amazon's so hormonal, you know. So it seems to be increasing day length that will trigger hormone production in these particular species. And so veterinarians will often give the advice that you should just put your bird to bed at 7 and wake it up at 7. However, the missing piece of information here is that it is not the amount of sleep, it's the amount of darkness. So if you're going to implement this, you've got to get blackout shades on that room, and then put so that no light comes and creeps in before that 12-hour period is over. But in the wild, grays, African grays have been observed flying after dark. Cockatoos often vocalize in the middle of the night. These are species who often can do quite well with 9 or 10 hours of sleep a night. And this is important because many times just a caregiver's work schedule will not even allow them any social time with their parrot if they think they've got to put it to bed at 6 o'clock every single night. They may get home at 5:30. So, often they can get more high quality time with their bird if they just take advantage of this information. So I think you need to evaluate every case individually rather than just relying on the rules. So I think this is just pretty much what I already said. One additional point, African grays and cockatoos tend to go to nest in the winter. So you'll see more hormonal behavior from them starting in November and December. So if you think you're going to stop that by, decreasing day length, that is not going to help at all. All right, so I have a case right now. The woman's name is Joni and the African gray's name is Hannah. I mentioned her just briefly earlier. She was the one who almost died because of egg binding last September. And so the triggers present for them were pair bond with Joan, unlimited shoulder time, unlimited cavity seeking in the kitchen, eating a really high-fat, high-carb diet, and she has a very strange sleep schedule because Joni hates her husband. And so her solution for this is to not get up until noon after he's gone to work and not to go to bed until midnight. And she keeps Hannah on that schedule. So what does that do to Hannah's day length? Her day length is from midnight to whenever it gets dark outside. It's very, very decreased. So that is a factor in keeping Hannah pretty darn hormonal. And so I'm still trying to convince Joni to adjust her sleep schedule. But this is a case where there's so much that needs to be changed. That veterinarian, who's very knowledgeable about behavior, could not possibly address all of this. Exercise, I think, is a potential cause, again, when combined with others. Certainly exercise enjoys all species to have better health and relaxation. A flighted parrot's going to exercise himself naturally. When it comes to exercising a clipped bird, you have to be very, very careful. The old advice has been that you should get the bird on your hand and then drop your hand so that the bird will flap his wings. This is very damaging to the relationship between a parrot and a caregiver. And I actually had one case where this African gray was just delightful. He never bit. He always stepped up. She took him to the vet, doing the right thing to get an annual exam. The vet said, I think he's a little pudgy. You should exercise him, so do this. Within a week, that bird would not step up, and he was biting now because that was such a scary experience for him. Just to have that firm perch drop out from underneath him. And also, flapping wings for overweight birds is not fun, and flapping clipped wings is not fun. It feels differently to them as those wings move through the air, so it can be really challenging to encourage this. But I found you can make some progress by getting one of those perches that used to be called boings. They're coiled rope perches. You can hang them from the ceiling and put them on a swivel hook. And so they bounce a a little bit if the parrot moves. That helps to create some strength in their legs and their feet, and it helps them achieve a little better balance. But also, if the bird happens to flap his wings, it will turn around in a circle. And enough time spent on those teaches that bird that that can be pretty darn fun. So that's one way that you can start to encourage some exercise. Another way, teach the bird targeting, and just teach them to walk or run along the floor or climb the stairs in order to come to you when you call them. If you have a bird who does ever flap his wings, you can capture that as a behavior, of course, and turn it into a cued behavior. And if the bird's an appropriate candidate, of course, consider full flight. Foreign substances on feathers is a very rare cause of this problem, but it does happen. So it is something to take into account. You know, you can ask a caregiver, well, how do you spend time with your parrot? I always ask this question. There was one case where the caregiver would have his parrot sitting right there, and he'd eat a potato chip and pet his parrot, and eat a potato chip and pet his parrot, and that parrot had so much grease and other junk, you know, on the back of his feathers, he did start some feather damaging behavior there. And I also had a case where I sold one of my baby grays, and I was lucky enough when I was breeding to have Phoebe Linden as a mentor. So all my babies were abundance weaned, they were all fledged and learned to fly really well. In the last couple years, none of them they didn't even have their wings clipped. So these birds were pretty bulletproof. And so when this caregiver called me and said he's feather picking over his back, I was dumbfounded and mystified. But once we started talking, the information tumbled out that she always showered with him, and she wasn't necessarily very good about rinsing him off. So he had shampoo and soap on his feathers, and as soon as she got a shower perch where he wasn't down on the floor of the shower and she took care to rinse him off, it stopped completely and never recurred. Cigarette smoke has been anecdotally implicated in this problem. A lot of people whose parrots start this, they go right to the internet. They find things like Pluck No More, you know, Avacalm. These things are just money makers. I've never known them to be of any benefit whatsoever. Again, another very common recommendation is spray your bird with aloe vera. Why would you do that? I can't even understand the rationale for that, you know. Parrots don't like having stuff on their feathers. You know, sometimes you just have to engage your common sense, and certainly in the wild, there's no aloe vera spray that bird is getting. So just plain bathing is fine, yes.
I was told apple cider vinegar to spray them when they're flying. I've been told this a couple of times.
I think I've heard that. Don't do that.
May I say something?
Absolutely.
Cider vinegar, at the Gabriel Foundation, we have around 600 birds every day, and we find apple cider vinegar works really well if it's used prophylactically in the water for a specific period of time and rotated throughout the year. All these old myths of spraying aloe vera on the feathers are old myths. If you've ever sprayed a bird with aloe vera, you'll see that it gets very, very tacky and sticky. And actually, after that, the incidence of feather picking can really, really change. One of the things that we do when we get a bird that comes in and has severe feather destructive behavior, or it's naked, or in the case like the Red Lord Amazon that Pam showed earlier that has that very sort of sticky, tacky skin, that's what we experience, we may use OxyFresh Gelée and give it a really nice bath in a warm area, pat it dry, either put it in front of a convection heated panel, pat it dry really nicely. If it's a cold day, we'll make sure that there's no draft, and we'll put it in front of a sunny spot so that it can just dry. A little shivering is okay, it uses up calories. The other myth out there is, oh, spray it with hydrogen peroxide in the water. And people don't know the dilution of these concentrates. If a little bit's good, a whole lot's better. And pretty soon, you have a bird that's changed color. So really, the best kind of water that you can use, and if you don't have great water in your area, which not everyone does, use distilled water. or use that kind of water that's used for babies. It's not distilled, it's artisanal water or something like that. And you know, try the bath. OxyFresh Gelée is available worldwide. It comes in small containers. A little bit does a lot of great good. We'll oftentimes put them in our hospital wet sink. We'll put a towel on the bottom so that it's not slippery, because the bottom of the hospital sink is stainless steel. It can be a little scary. It's very soothing. One person is in there taking their time. We'll start out with a little bit of water, and gradually you just kind of move your hands in this manner with the bird. Rinse it dry. By that time, the bird is generally, I would say 9 times out of 10, incredibly relaxed. It feels good, and then you can follow through with that. And start with a clean base. Really important. Stay away also from chlorhexidine spray baths, unless perhaps you've been medically advised by a veterinarian to take care of that. And certainly never put any of the dried powders that are supposed to help, or as Pam was so rightfully stating, in our opinion, any of those pseudo materials, Avicom or Avistress, or any of those things that are just over-the-counter cons. Sorry, and pay attention to that. And after 25 years of observing that protocol with as many birds as we've had come through us, I really stand by those procedures.
Yeah, that is all excellent advice, exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned the apple cider vinegar in the water. I do that with my birds. It serves for birds as a great prebiotic. And with the first vet I worked for, he was a firm believer in doing fecal gram stains on every bird annually. And if they had a certain percentage of gram-negative bacteria that did not necessarily require antibiotic treatment, if the bird was displaying normal symptoms, he would just have them put apple cider vinegar in the water and, you know, into the drinking water for 2 weeks, and then we would have that bird come back and we'd repeat that test, and it would be completely resolved. So it can be a very beneficial not treatment, but, you know, adjunct to care. I typically do it about, you know, once a week, a month, or a week every 2 months, depending upon how lazy I am. And if you go online, you can find recommendations for the correct concentration for that. All right, so additional factors to consider. Of course, many owners reinforce the behavior, right? The bird, you know, for one thing, the caregiver usually can't tell the difference between normal preening and feather destructive behavior. So every time it sees the bird messing with its feathers, it goes over and pets it or tells it, you know, in some way gives it social attention. So you do need to either get them to ignore the behavior or give them an alternate intervention. Some people just cannot ignore it. Their anxiety levels are just too stinking high. And so I will give them a protocol which goes like this. You create a distraction that the bird has no idea is directed towards him at all. So, you know, they might tap a spoon against a pot or shove a book off onto the floor when they think the bird is engaged in feather destruction. They don't want to scare the bird. You have to make sure that you stipulate that. But what you want is just for the bird to look up, to think, well, what was that all about? And then at that point, the caregiver can go over and offer a foot toy or something that the bird would enjoy having. And if he takes it and starts to play with it, that's the end of that incident, and the owner walks away. If the bird does not take the toy or takes the toy and drops it, then I have them step the bird up and just move it to a new location. I think, frankly, this is of minimal effectiveness, but it gives the owner something to do that does not reinforce the behavior. And, you know, there have been a couple of cases where people thought that it was very, very effective. I think it's hard for parrots to live singly. I think that is a source of stress. I never recommend that anybody get a parrot as company for their first parrot. You know, I only say get a parrot if you want one yourself. But I always cheer when somebody gets 2 young birds at a time, or you know, there are multiple birds in the household, because I think they derive a great deal of benefit from just having more birdness in the house. Again, another study by Meehan, Garner, and Mensch in 2003 looked at the impact of birds living singly or with another bird. Now, when I read this study, I was not clear about whether these birds were pair bonded or just company for each other. But they did believe that the parrot housed with another bird, they used their environments more, they were more active, they spent less time screaming, less time preening, and less time being inactive. So the paired parrots showed significantly less, they also showed significantly less fearful and aggressive behavior to unfamiliar handlers as well. So there is no doubt that they derive some support from each other when you have multiple parrots in the house. So this is fun. This is one of the cases I did quite a while ago, actually. So this little bird here is 6 months old. And what had happened was that a mother had been driving her children to school. She got into an accident that was her fault, and her daughter was rendered a paraplegic as a result of the accident. So the high school, all of her friends at the high school, the teachers, the principal, they were just devastated, and they felt so bad for her that they did the most logical thing, of course, which was to buy her an African gray baby parrot. Here's a good example of that feather picking point and how it gets reached. So it was a force-weaned, unfledged baby. They'd never had a parrot before. They were completely inexperienced. They were still suffering all of the stress from this tragedy that had happened. Further, the bird was given a too short wing trim, so it began falling frequently, injuring its keel bone, which is why they named it Timber. Don't you love that? So this bird was, you know, frankly, they had the good sense after about 6 months to give this bird up. So this photo was taken when it landed in its new home. And this is the bird at age 3. The caregiver did everything, the new caregiver did everything that I have outlined here in this presentation, including the provision of an outdoor aviary in Ohio. And that's what this bird looked like at age 3. So don't ever let anybody tell you that these cases are impossible. But again, this is a good example of when you get things on the right track before the behavior's gone on too long, you can really quickly achieve a full resolution. Here's another case. This is Linus and Gracie. These, again, were force-weaned, unfledged babies. They were sold to the same owner. There were very high stress levels in the household because these people were experiencing quite a bit of marital discord. The birds were eating a seed mix. They were never bathed, and they had no destroyable toys. And if you remember that macaw I showed you earlier, that bird was from the same household as well. So this is what they looked like in February 2007 when we began the consultation. Look how quickly things turned around. This is just 6 months later. Just by implementing everything that I have outlined here, these birds effected a full recovery. So it's a problem that can be solved. So just to summarize, absolutely in every case, recommend a veterinary evaluation, examine every single aspect of that parrot's existence, identifying any factors that you think could possibly contribute to the problem, recommend necessary changes, follow up at regular intervals, and coach like a mother. Weekly check-ins at first, so that you really get these folks on the right track. Thank you so much for your flexibility and